So over the weekend, CNN of all networks did an expose where they interviewed the former CDC chief, and he revealed that he believes that the virus actually did come from a lab in Wuhan, China, that this was a man-made or a man-manipulated virus that was released from a Wuhan lab in China. Now, he doesn't say that it was released intentionally. He's not implying intent. He says it could have been an accident where a virologist or some lab worker got infected with the virus and then ended up going out in the world and it was a total accident. He doesn't say China did this intentionally, but he says in his professional opinion, which is a pretty significant professional opinion, he believes that the virus came from a lab in Wuhan. Now, this is a guy who, he was the chief of the CDC. He knows how the government works when it comes to, he's a virologist. He also has been in on government information that the rest of us are not in on, not currently, not recently, but during his time of being there. So he understands that he knows that viruses are played around with in labs and that they're manipulated in labs and that, you never know, anything could happen and somebody could get infected and then suddenly that virus goes out there. He also is a virologist, so he understands how viruses work. And he's sitting there saying, this virus doesn't behave like a virus that was made in nature. This virus behaves differently. And that leads him to believe that this is something that was actually created in a lab in Wuhan. Let's go ahead and play this clip for you. And then we're going to dissect this a little further.
Started transmitting somewhere in September, October in Wuhan.
September, October.
That's my own view. It's an only opinion. I'm allowed to have opinions. Now, I am of the point of view that I still think the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory. Escaped. Other people don't believe that. That's fine. Science will eventually figure it out. It's not unusual for respiratory pathogens that are being worked on in a laboratory to infect a laboratory worker.
It is also not unusual for that type of research to be occurring in Wuhan. The city is a widely known center for viral studies in China, including the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has experimented extensively with bat coronaviruses.
It is a remarkable conversation I feel like we're having here because you are the former CDC director and you were the director at the time this was all happening.
For the first time, the former CDC director is stating publicly that he believes this pandemic started months earlier than we knew, and that it originated not at a wet market, but inside a lab in China.
These are two significant things to say, Dr. Redfield.
That's not implying any intentionality. It's my opinion, right? But I am a virologist. I have spent my life in virology. I do not believe this somehow came from a bat to a human, and at that moment in time, the virus that came to the human became one of the most infectious viruses that we know in humanity for human-to-human transmission. Normally when a pathogen goes from a zoonotic to human, it takes a while for it to figure out how to become more and more efficient in human-to-human transmission. I just don't think this makes biological sense.
So in the lab, do you think that process of becoming more efficient was happening? Is that what you were suggesting?
Yeah, let's just say I have coronavirus that I'm working on. Most of us in the lab, we're trying to grow a virus. We try to help make it grow better and better and better and better and better and better so we can do experiments and figure out about it. That's the way I put it together.
Yeah, okay, so we're going to stop there for just a second with, so look, so watching CNN today when they were talking, or just over the last couple of days as they've talked more and more about this interview that Sanjay Gupta did with the former CDC chief, they're surprised, right? They're like, oh my gosh, so you're claiming that this virus maybe came out well before we believe in December or January, but back in September, because he made this claim that it happened in September. And yeah, that has been, I reported on that months ago on this show, where many of the scientists were saying they have evidence of the virus being around well before we believed. So we have tissue samples from livers in Italy, where the only way they were able to get those tissue samples was they took the tissue samples back in October of 2019, and those people had antibodies for COVID already, which meant that they had been infected at least in September. if not a little earlier than that. So we have these tissue samples from liver tissue. We've got blood samples here in the United States. There was one in the Bay Area where they also found that the person had been infected at least by October or September earlier of 2019, earlier than they believed that the virus had been circulating around. So we already had the science on this. But the problem was CNN, MSNBC, these news or outlets that were doing everything they could to get Biden elected were unwilling to touch this information. They were not talking about it. If you talked about it, you were a conspiracy theorist. If you said, well, maybe this did come from a lab in Wuhan. Remember, Trump was going around saying, that came from China. Suddenly you were a conspiracy theorist. And I understand, look, the Asian population, which I am an Asian woman and I am frightened for the Asian community right now because there is an uptick in hate crimes because of this rhetoric where, people believe, it was these Asian people that came around and gave it to us. I'm afraid of that, but look, the truth is the truth is the truth. And we can't just ignore the truth because we want, some other outcome or some other reality. We just can't do that. We have to understand that. We have to embrace the truth in order to get to the bottom of things. And so, look, a lot of people were saying they believe this came from a lab. To me, I felt like there was a real possibility that it did. We still don't have the information. And then people would say, well, show me the proof. There's no proof that this came from a lab. Where's the proof? Well, where's the proof it came from a bat? Show me the bat. Nobody's been able to produce the bat. So you can't say, no, it definitely didn't come from a lab. That's a conspiracy theory when you also don't have the bat. You have no evidence to counter that as well. So there's no evidence really either way. But you do have a virologist who led the CDC here in the United States who's sitting there saying, this virus doesn't exactly behave like a virus we find in nature. He's a virologist. He studies viruses and he says, this one's different. And this one maybe came from a lab in a place where they were actively studying bat coronaviruses. Another video that I did, which I had to remove from YouTube. One thing I did was I scrubbed all my videos off of YouTube that had to do with the to do with the virus. One other video was the fact that Fauci and various different organizations in the United States were funding that research and funding the manipulation of these viruses, which is very controversial, considered unethical. Of course, they don't want to do it on American soil, so they do it where they feel like they can ethically get away with it because the American people would rise up and say, whoa, we don't want that. We don't want to be doing that with our money. And instead, they take our money and they go offshore and they do things that we, the American people, would find unethical. One of those things was manipulating viruses. The reason that's unethical is because what are you doing when you're manipulating them? What are you manipulating them to do and be? And how do you know that's not going to somehow accidentally leak from the lab and unleash chaos upon the world, which potentially this has? So this is not an indictment on China necessarily. This is an indictment on all of them that were involved in this. There were multiple countries funding this point of gain research or gain of function research, which is what it's called when they take a virus and they try to manipulate it around and try to get it to function differently. There are many countries that were engaging in this. It happened to be that the lab was in China. They do this type of manipulation in other countries as well. It's very dangerous, and we see the effects of it potentially. They're frightened about this. Let me show you this other video. This is the CDC director now, and she's coming out, she's visibly shaken. She's pleading with us to watch out because we're not out of the woods yet. Let's watch this and we're going to break this down and see how this all connects because it all does.
When I first started at CDC about 2 months ago, I made a promise to you. I would tell you the truth, even if it was not the news we wanted to hear. Now is one of those times when I have to share the truth and I have to hope and trust you will listen. I'm going to pause here. I'm going to lose the script and I'm going to reflect on the recurring feeling I have of impending doom. We have so much to look forward to, so much promise and potential of where we are, and so much reason for hope. But right now I'm scared. I know what it's like as a physician to stand in that patient room, gowned, gloved, masked, shielded, and to be the last person to touch someone else's loved one because their loved one couldn't be there. I know what it's like when you're the physician, when you're the healthcare provider, and you're worried that you don't have the resources to take care of the patients in front of you. I know that feeling of nausea when you read the crisis standards of care and you wonder whether there are going to be enough ventilators to go around and who's going to make that choice. And I know what it's like to pull up to your hospital every day and see the extra morgue sitting outside. I didn't know at the time when it would stop. We didn't have the science to tell us. We were just scared. We have come such a long way. 3 historic scientific breakthrough vaccines, and we are rolling them out so very fast. So I'm speaking today not necessarily as your CDC director, or not only as your CDC director, but as a wife, as a mother, as a daughter, to ask you to just please hold on a little while longer. I so badly want to be done. I know you all so badly want to be done. We are just almost there, but not quite yet. And so I'm asking you to just hold on a little longer, to get vaccinated when you can, so that all of those people that we all love will still be here when this pandemic ends. The trajectory of the pandemic in the United States looks similar to many other countries in Europe, including Germany, Italy, and France. Looked like just a few weeks ago. And since that time, those countries have experienced a consistent and worrying spike in cases. We are not powerless. We can change this trajectory of the pandemic, but it will take all of us recommitting to following the public health prevention strategies consistently while we work to get the American public vaccinated. I'm calling on our elected officials, our faith-based communities, our civic leaders, and our other influencers in communities across the nation. And I'm calling on every single one of you to sound the alarm, to carry these messages into your community and your spheres of influence. We do not have the luxury of inaction. For the health of our country, we must work together now to prevent a 4th surge.
Okay. So let's break that down a little bit, because I think this has to do with a lot with the former CDC director saying that he thinks that this came from a lab. So there was the current CDC director visibly shaken, saying that she feels impending doom. Okay, that we can't let up now. Oh, no, it's coming. And she even says something very shocking where she says she sees the rise in cases and the rise of hospitalizations happening in the U.S. that has happened all across Europe. And in Europe, it was they're in another shutdown. So they've just recently shut down. And she's saying, I see that coming. It's coming. So that's one thing we all should be a little bit worried about, is like, oh, no, are we really going to go into another lockdown? Because that's what she's basically saying, is that, yes, it's looking like there's an increase, and that increase is mirroring Europe, and we're going to head in that direction. And that's what I've said to you guys before, which is we're always about 3 to 4 weeks behind Europe. And so they've been shutting down for the last week or two. So we're, a couple of weeks away from potentially a lockdown again. Hopefully that won't happen. Hopefully we've had more infection over here. We didn't do as much lockdown as they did. And so hopefully, it won't rise up too much, but you never know. And you never know at what point they want to lock us down, even if it's not nearly as bad as it was previously. But where I get really concerned about this is a new study came out today saying, so I want you to look at this. Here's the story. This is from statnews.com. Real world study by the CDC. So that was where the woman was the CDC director. By the CDC shows Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were 90% effective. Okay. So it says here, a new study suggests the messenger RNA vaccines produced by Moderna and Pfizer appear to be 90% effective in preventing COVID-19 infection in a real-world setting. So they released a study today. They followed 4,000 healthcare workers, first responders, and other essential workers in 8 U.S. locations as the first COVID vaccines rolled out. So they inoculated, they were looking at 4,000 different people. They inoculated a certain percentage of them, and some did not want to get the vaccine. So they followed those who were vaccinated versus those who were unvaccinated, and they found that there were 161 COVID infections in the unvaccinated workers, compared with 16 in the workers who had received only 1 dose by the time of their infection, and only 3 infections in the people who had received both doses. So they're saying that's significant, and that is significant. If you've got 161 infections that came from the unvaccinated group and you only have 16 from the 1 vaccine shot group and 3 from the 2 vaccine shot, that's significant. That actually shows a lot of promise with these vaccines. It shows that the vaccines might actually be effective and they might actually be working. So another thing to show you here. So we're seeing this good news, right? Good news, the vaccines look like they work. We don't know how long they work still. We don't know if they prevent spread. We don't know the long-term side effects of the vaccines. But right now, just from that little glimpse of a window, we can see that, okay, it looks like it's effective at preventing people from getting sick from the virus if they're, the likelihood is they won't if they take one of these shots. That's good news, okay? But here, let me look at this for you. Here's from the CDC. This is from usnews.com. 15% of the U.S. population is fully vaccinated against the coronavirus. Okay, over 51 million people have been fully vaccinated. That's 15%. 93 million people have received at least 1 dose. So, now you're looking at, when you look at 93 million, what is that? Let's just see what the percentage of that is. Let me get my calculator out. We have 330 people in 330 million. So 28%, so nearly 30%. Okay, so according to the study that they released today, was that if you got 1 dose, it was 80% effective at halting the disease. And if you got 2, then it went up to 90% effective, okay? What we have is 15% of the U.S. population fully vaccinated, and double that, 30% nearly, 1 dose. So 30% of the U.S. population is at least 80% protected against the virus, and 15% are 90% protected against the virus. So that makes you wonder and question, because you know that the vast majority of those people are in the category of 65 and older. Let me show you this. This is the percentage of the population in the U.S. 65 and older. It's 16.5%. This is the percentage of Americans 65 and older. Okay, simple math here. So if you've got 16% vaccinated fully, 15%, so roughly the same percentage as what we have in the U.S. population in the most vulnerable category of those who are dying from this disease, those who are hospitalized, right? Okay, we know that of that 15%, probably not all of them are 65 and older. We do have a lot of healthcare workers, teachers, essential workers who receive the vaccine. But surely that 30% who've been vaccinated in the U.S., the vast majority of those 65 and older have had at least 1 dose of this vaccine at some point. Everybody I know in that age category at this point, if they wanted the vaccine, got it, okay? So then why is the CDC chief freaking out? Why is she freaking out? This is my big question. If the science shows that the vaccine works, and if the data shows that the majority of people in the most vulnerable of categories have been vaccinated, then why is she freaking out? Why would we need to go into another lockdown? If we're not seeing the rates of why are hospitalizations going up? Why are deaths still going up if the vaccine works? And if the vaccine works, why would we need to freak out and potentially go into another lockdown? Why would we need to behave like this and say, okay, we all have to wear masks, socially distance? She's crying on camera saying, please, please, I'm begging you, doomsday is coming. And yet we've had 30% of the population vaccinated. Somebody explain this to me. How is that working? That doesn't make any actual logical or scientific sense. The only way that makes sense is if the former CDC director is right, and this came from a lab, and it's a manipulated virus, and they know that this sucker is going to defeat the vaccine. They know that this thing is a beast in and of itself, and this thing can do things they don't even really fully understand. It is not going to behave like your normal measles or polio or chicken pox or even influenza, but that this instead is going to behave differently. They know this because they must. Otherwise, they wouldn't be behaving like this. And also, it kind of makes you wonder, in the very beginning, I mean, we've seen other crazy viruses come around, right? We saw SARS, we saw Ebola. There's all kinds of crazy viruses that have cropped up, reared their ugly head and circulated around the world. And we didn't have this mass panic, mass shutdown. That is the one thing that made me wonder early on, maybe this came from a lab, was maybe they knew. And, it was top secret information. They couldn't let the public know for good reason, because honestly, if they came out and said, we really do think this came from the lab. I mean, Trump, he was saying what he was saying. But if they really allowed him to fully say what he wanted to say, even more aggressively, then we probably would be at war with China. It wouldn't just be this sort of tit for tat, angry, chit chat and jabs back and forth, but it would be an actual all out war potentially. And so maybe they just didn't want to go that far. But one thing that was very odd was that country after country, leader after leader was just shutting down their country, saying, you know what, we don't care. People might starve. Everybody's going to lose their job. This is going to be mayhem. It's going to be terrible, but we've got to shut down. The only thing that made me think this came from a lab was that attitude, that behavior, that odd and sudden behavior from all of these world leaders that just said, shut it down. And so many of the population saying, we can't, we'll starve to death. We can't lose our jobs. I mean, we just can't go down that road. And the leaders saying, we don't care. You have to do it. You have to shut down. And it just made me think, maybe they know something that they're not sharing with us. Maybe they know more than they're letting on. And maybe they know, or at least they have strong levels of suspicion, but they don't fully know, so they can't do full accusations, but they really suspect that this actually did come from a lab, and it's a virus that will behave in a way that they just don't understand and they don't know. And in which case, that is really scary. That's a scary situation. Because what that means, if that's the case, is we do need to reevaluate how we respond to these kinds of things. We can't just have a willy-nilly attitude and just say, whatever, do what you want, freedom and personal choice, which, hey, I'm the one that was like saying that, right? I'm the one that says, hey, personal freedom, personal choice, it's up to you. Do what is best for you and your family. And just like they did in India after the first 10 weeks when they realized we can't shut down like this. And that's how they did it. That's what Japan did. That's what Sweden did. We have enough countries now, enough guinea pigs. We now had Florida do it and Georgia do it. And we've had many even states in the union do it. And we didn't see, doomsday show up for them any more than it did anywhere else. It was all the same no matter what the response was. So I was in that camp of the data is clear, and the data is showing early on that it wasn't nearly as deadly as they were going around saying it was. They said 2-3 million people would die in the United States, and it was really more like 200,000. That's a lot. That's tragic. I mean, very, but it wasn't 2 million. It was about 200. They inflate the numbers to 500 and so forth, but that's not the real number when you actually, and I've done shows on this showcasing exactly how that number's totally inflated. That includes everybody who would have died from other causes when you actually look at the deaths that were over the expected amount. You look at countries like Sweden, by the way. Sweden did not have any more deaths. Interestingly, Sweden did not have any more. Their death rate was the same 2020 as it was in 2019 and 2018 and 2017. It was all the same. Ours did go up a bit. That is the fact. It did go up. It wasn't a hoax. People died. It just wasn't 2 million people. But nonetheless, this makes us, we do have to consider this. If these types of biological weapons can be unleashed, what did we learn from this? What have we learned? Have we learned anything? Are we going to do anything different next time? When they say, look, you really got to wear a mask, you really got to socially distance. We've really got something weird on our hands. Are we going to react the same? Now, I think if they knew any information, if they knew it came from a lab, if we find out this came from a lab in the US, now that's what China's saying. China is still saying, how do you know it came from us? It could have come from you. And they're looking at the US saying it could have come from a US military virology lab. And they're not wrong. It could have. This guy is saying, it came from Wuhan in China. But the studies, the liver samples and the blood samples, those are in Italy and those are in the United States. So and by the way, we've got military base in Italy. It's one of our largest. So we've got, who knows where this thing came from. But if it, I believe it looks like it came from a lab. I can buy that because of the way leaders responded, the way the virus is reacting. I can buy that. The way the CDC director's acting when we've got 30% of the country inoculated and she's still freaking out saying, everybody hide. It leads me to believe, okay, maybe it did come from a lab and maybe they know this and they know this thing is just not behaving like normal and they don't know what else it's going to do and they're afraid of that. That's fair enough, but they should be upfront about that with us. And maybe they're starting to. Maybe that is why CNN, of all networks, has now decided to come forward with this and say, well, we've got shocking breaking news. We're now going to say what Republicans had been saying this whole time. What Trump has been saying this whole time. We're now going to say, maybe it's true. And maybe they're doing that because they do need to instill in us a sense of awareness so that we can say, oh, crap, we're not just dealing with some thing that is, Mother Nature. Because typically what happens is the more efficient a virus becomes in nature, it becomes less deadly. So if it spreads faster, it's less deadly. And the effects are not felt as much on people. And the fact that this particular virus, now I think why they think this came from China, probably because of the, I'm just speculating, but why they would suspect it to come from that part of the world more than the West is because of the way it hit the West, how it has acted in a way sort of like a biological weapon, right? It is really, especially South America, it's really hit them hard. It's hit the West really, really hard, but it hasn't really hit Asia that hard. And it really didn't matter how the Asian country responded. A lot of people say, well, it's because, and they give off all these ridiculous things that don't make sense because they're not consistent. So look, like you can't say, well, it's because they shut down. No, they didn't. Not everybody did. Japan didn't. South Korea never really did a shutdown. A lot of areas never really did shutdowns. They say, well, it's because they wear masks. Japan, are you kidding? They were in movie theaters eating popcorn and candy and watching movies without masks. If you go and you watch videos of what life was like in Japan over 2020, food courts were open, people were eating, movie theaters were open, people were often not wearing their masks. Yes, it is part of Asian culture to wear a mask when you're doing public transit, but and you're kind of walking around. But otherwise, there's a lot of taking off that mask as well. And they take it off a lot to take selfies. It's a big thing. Take a lot of selfies, remove the mask. So there was no consistent response in Asia, yet the Asian countries all pretty much got hit the same. And there was no consistent response in the West, and yet no matter the response, from lockdown to no lockdown, it all looked pretty much the same. Everything looked pretty much the same. So it seems that, this virus is just going to virus, and for some reason, it is affecting certain groups, I would say ethnic groups or, racial groups, whatever. It seems to be affecting some harder than others. And that is interesting. It could be that these types of viruses have circulated around Asia and they have a background immunity that the West doesn't have. And so it has nothing to do with the manipulated virus, that attacks certain genomes over others. That's also very, very likely. It's very likely that Asia and Australia, where there's a lot of cross-travel and a lot of cross-pollination of viruses, they have a natural protection. That would really explain heavily why South America is getting hit so hard. They don't have a lot of cross-travel. They don't get a lot of travel from Asia, and they don't travel much to Asia. A lot of those countries are too poor. People don't come to their countries. They don't leave their countries. North America and Europe is getting hit pretty hard, but not as hard as South America. But there's a lot more travel between China and Asia and the West, not as much as there is with New Zealand and Australia. So that would actually explain quite a bit. In my mind, that's a little bit more believable than thinking that this thing was created in a way that is targeting certain genotypes or racial groups. I think it has more to do with background immunity. But then you wonder, well, where did they get the virus to start playing around with, right? So people maybe had some sort of background immunity from these similar types of viruses. But nonetheless, this opens up a big conversation and huge conversation, actually, because this opens up one, so now CNN's coming around saying, well, maybe it was made in a lab and maybe we all need to know about this so that we can all maybe take things a little bit more seriously when we realize the vaccines maybe do work or don't work or whatever it is. And if they don't work, then they can start showing why they don't work. And these big pharma companies can have a big excuse as to why they don't work because it wasn't their fault. It was a lab-made virus. It's different than what they're used to working with. So there's a lot of, they're padding it right now, it seems like, for failure. They're padding it for everybody to, think differently about this. It's interesting it's coming from CNN. Another part of this conversation that this opens up is what else do they lie to us about? What are the other topics? And I can name several, but I'm not going to. Otherwise, I'll be banned completely from the platform. But there are other topics that they've pretty much said, if you breathe this, then you are QAnon. If you breathe this, if you whisper it, then you are a conspiracy theorist. You are against science and facts, and we're not going to allow it to be even discussed. And that's how they were about this, not as much as they are about other topics. I'm sure you can kind of guess which those topics are. They won't even allow debate or discussion about certain topics right now. Otherwise, you are scum of the earth. And they kind of treated this idea in that same way. And yet here they are, here they are now. Here they are saying, well, yeah, but maybe. And so that, because now, Joe Biden is in office and we don't have any risk anymore of Trump. And so now, it makes me wonder about a lot of other topics as well, which we know that they often sweep things under the rug, tell us all it's a bunch of conspiracy theories, that those of us who think it or believe it or wonder about it or want to debate about it or want to learn more about it, that we're all crazy lunatics, that we're against science and against truth and reality. And, and then later on when they feel all safe and cozy, then they say, well, it turns out, the truth is that Hunter Biden story was real. And now it turns out, maybe which by the way,